In all of recorded human history, there is exactly one moment where people looked at an advancing wall of molten rock and decided not to run. They decided to fight back, and they won. What happened on a small Icelandic island in January 1973 is not just one of the most remarkable disaster response stories ever documented. It is a story that has never been repeated, not once. In the 50 years since, with all of our advances in technology, material science, and volcanic monitoring, no one has successfully stopped a lava flow anywhere in the world. What those Icelanders achieved was either a triumph of human ingenuity combined with extraordinary luck, or a perfect alignment of circumstances so specific that it may never occur again, possibly both. This is the story of Eldfell, the fire mountain that tried to bury a town, and the people who refused to let it. Heimaey is the largest island in the Westman Islands archipelago off the southern coast of Iceland. In January 1973, it was home to approximately 5,300 people and one of the most productive fishing harbors in the North Atlantic. The fishing industry was not just important to Heimaey. It was Heimaey. The entire economy, the entire identity of the island revolved around that harbor and the boats that sailed from it. At approximately 1:55 in the morning on January 23, 1973, the eastern side of the island split open. Not with warning, not with the gradual buildup of seismic activity that sometimes gives volcanologists days or weeks to prepare. A fissure approximately 1.6 kilometers long simply tore open in the darkness, producing a curtain of fire visible from the mainland 50 kilometers away. What followed in the next few hours would have been a complete catastrophe, if not for a coincidence, so unlikely that islanders later described it as the hand of fate. Every fishing boat in Heimaey's fleet was in harbor. A powerful storm the previous day had driven the entire fleet home early. On a normal night, hundreds of fishermen would have been out at sea, unreachable. The boats that would be needed for evacuation would have been scattered across the North Atlantic. Instead, because of a storm nobody wanted, every vessel capable of carrying passengers was sitting in the harbor at the precise moment one was needed most. The second coincidence was the wind. Volcanic eruptions produce toxic gases, primarily sulfur dioxide, in quantities that can be lethal at close range. The direction that wind carried those gases in the first hours of the eruption was away from the town. Evacuating 5,300 people in the dark across a harbor onto fishing boats without being simultaneously gassed by volcanic emissions required the wind to cooperate. It cooperated. The third coincidence was the mayor. Not long before the eruption, local civil authorities had conducted evacuation drills. The specific logistics of moving large numbers of people from the island quickly had been thought through, practiced, and at least partially rehearsed. When the real event began, there was a framework to execute, rather than improvised chaos in the dark. By morning, the vast majority of Heimaey's population was on the mainland. The evacuation was essentially complete, and the lava was still coming. The fissure that opened on January 23rd was not the kind of dramatic explosive eruption that produces the mushroom clouds and ash falls most people associate with volcanic events. What it produced was something in some ways more dangerous and in some ways more manageable. Lava flows. Rivers of molten basalt, moving at speeds slow enough that a person could easily outpace them on foot, but carrying heat measured in hundreds of degrees in a mass that nothing built by human hands could resist. The lava began flowing toward the town, and more critically, toward the harbor entrance. If the harbor was closed, Heimaey was finished. Not just damaged or temporarily disrupted. Finished. A fishing economy without a harbor is not a fishing economy. The island's entire reason for existing, economically speaking, would be gone. And the lava was flowing directly toward the harbor mouth. For the first weeks, most of what happened on Heimaey was standard disaster response. Efforts to protect property, salvage equipment, document the damage. The assumption that pervaded these early efforts was the same assumption that has governed human responses to volcanic activity throughout history. You cannot stop lava. You retreat, you document, you wait for it to end on its own terms, and then you assess what is left. That assumption was about to be challenged by a physicist with an unusual idea. Professor Thorbjørn Sigurgeirsson was not a volcanologist. He was a physicist at the University of Iceland, and when he arrived at Heimaey and looked at the lava flow threatening the harbor, he saw the problem through a different lens than the geologists and disaster managers already on the ground. His analysis began with a question that seems almost childishly simple when you first hear it. What is lava, exactly? Molten rock. Rock that has been heated beyond its melting point and flows as a liquid. But unlike truly exotic substances, lava behaves in ways that are physically predictable. It flows because it is hot enough to be liquid. If you remove enough heat from it quickly enough, it solidifies. That is not a novel insight. Everyone knows that lava eventually cools and hardens. The novel insight was about rate and location. Sigurgeirsson proposed that you did not need to cool the entire flow. You did not need to somehow freeze millions of cubic meters of molten rock simultaneously. You needed to cool the front edge, the leading surface of the advancing lava, the part that was actually moving and covering new ground. If you could flash cool that front edge fast enough, it would vitrify. It would not just solidify into normal basalt. It would solidify into volcanic glass, a material called tachylite that formed almost instantaneously when molten basalt was cooled rapidly by cold water. This glass was harder and denser than normally cooled lava, and if you built a wall of this glass across the front of the advancing flow, subsequent lava moving behind the front would encounter a barrier it could not easily push through. The flow would slow. It would build up behind the glass barrier. It might divert sideways to find a path of lower resistance. The glass wall would not stop the lava in a dramatic Hollywood sense. It would redirect and slow it through what Sigurgeirsson described as a geological weld, a barrier formed from the lava itself by the lava itself, using the physics of rapid cooling. The mechanism required seawater, enormous quantities of it applied continuously to the advancing lava front by pumps operating at industrial scale. Heimaey had something most threatened locations do not. The sea was close. The harbor, the very feature the lava was threatening, was also the source of the cooling agent that might save it. The proposal was approved, and what followed was one of the most extraordinary engineering operations ever attempted under active geological emergency conditions. 370 volunteers. This is the human number that defines the Eldfell operation. 370 people who chose to return to an island actively erupting, where the temperature near the lava front reached 200 degrees Celsius, where the ground itself was hot enough in places to melt boot soles, where the air smelled of sulfur and the sky glowed red at night. They did not have to be there. Evacuation was complete. The island was officially abandoned except for the operation. Every person who went back was making a choice to work in conditions that would be considered unacceptable by any modern occupational health standard. They pumped seawater onto the lava front continuously, not for an hour or a day, for months. The pumping operation eventually reached a peak capacity of approximately 1 cubic meter of seawater per second being applied to the lava. Pipes were laid across cooling lava, sometimes across surfaces hot enough to soften the pipes themselves. Equipment failed regularly in the extreme heat and had to be repaired or replaced. Workers operated in rotating shifts because no human body could sustain exposure to 200-degree ambient temperatures for extended periods. And the physics slowly began to work. The lava front slowed. The glass armor that Sigurgeirsson had predicted began to form. Subsequent lava built up behind the barrier rather than flowing over it. The harbor entrance, which the models had suggested would be closed within weeks without intervention, remained open. By the time the eruption ended in early July 1973, approximately 5 months after it began, the harbor was still there, significantly narrowed, partially filled with cooled lava, but functional. The town behind it was partially buried. Approximately 400 buildings had been destroyed, but the economic lifeline of the island, the harbor that made Heimaey worth rebuilding, had been preserved. The Eldfell operation is documented and analyzed by volcanologists and disaster managers as a genuine historical success. But what makes it genuinely interesting for the modern world is not the success itself. It is why the success has never been repeated. The conditions that made Eldfell possible were not just favorable, they were uniquely, almost impossibly favorable in combination. Consider the lava type. Basaltic lava from Eldfell was fluid enough to flow but slow enough to pump against effectively. Different compositions of lava move at radically different speeds. Some lava flows advance faster than a person can run. The pumping strategy that worked at Eldfell would be physically impossible to execute against a faster moving flow. Consider the proximity to water. The pumping operation required enormous quantities of cold seawater delivered continuously. Eldfell was literally surrounded by the North Atlantic. Most volcanic events that threaten populated areas do not occur at the edge of an ocean with unlimited cold water immediately available. Consider the scale. Eldfell was a relatively contained flow threatening a specific, defined location. The lava volumes were large, but not on the scale of the flows that threatened La Palma in 2021 or Kilauea in 2018. Those events involved lava volumes and flow dynamics that would have required cooling operations orders of magnitude larger than anything executed at Heimaey. At La Palma, the eruption that began in September 2021 and lasted nearly 3 months produced lava flows that destroyed over 3,000 buildings and reached the sea despite extensive modern monitoring and disaster response resources. No pumping operation was attempted. No lava redirection succeeded. The people of La Palma watched and waited, just as humans have watched and waited through virtually every volcanic disaster in history. At Kilauea, the 2018 eruption produced lava that consumed entire neighborhoods in Lower Puna with a speed and volume that made any intervention attempt impractical. Modern Hawaii has better monitoring, better evacuation infrastructure, and better scientific understanding of volcanic behavior than Heimaey had in 1973. None of that translated into any ability to alter where the lava went. The comparison is sobering. 50 years of technological advancement have not meaningfully changed the fundamental human relationship with lava flows. We are better at predicting them, better at evacuating from them, better at monitoring them. We are no better at stopping them than we were in 1973, except for the single exception that proves the rule. There is one more dimension to the Eldfell story that tends to get overlooked in accounts focused on the dramatic narrative of people fighting a volcano. The cooled lava that built up during the pumping operation, the very material that was threatening the harbor, eventually became part of the harbor's long-term protection. The solidified lava formed a natural breakwater on the eastern side of the harbor entrance. Storms that had previously exposed the harbor to significant wave action were now partially blocked by the geological structure that the eruption and the cooling operation had together created. The harbor became safer after the eruption than it had been before. Actuarial calculations performed after the event reached a conclusion that is almost too neat to believe. The insurance value of storm damage prevented by the new natural breakwater over subsequent decades exceeded the total cost of the entire pumping operation. Heimaey did not just survive the eruption. In a specific, measurable economic sense, it came out ahead. What does Eldfell ultimately mean for us? It means that the human instinct to resist, rather than simply retreat, is not always futile, that physics can be applied to geological events in ways that alter outcomes, that the right combination of scientific insight, available resources, physical conditions, and human courage can achieve something that looks from the outside like a miracle, but is, on examination, a logical application of cold water to hot rock. But it also means something more cautious. Eldfell was possible because of specific conditions that aligned in a specific place at a specific time. The physics Sigurd Garrison proposed are real. The method works when the conditions support it. The conditions have not aligned the same way since. Humanity's relationship with volcanic activity remains fundamentally unchanged from what it was before 1973. We watch, we monitor, we evacuate, we document the destruction, and rebuild afterward. Except for once, on a small Icelandic island in the middle of winter with a fishing fleet in harbor, and the wind blowing the right direction, and a physicist who asked a simple question. Once in history, we argued with lava, and lava lost.